Okie dokie. Everyone here, thank you very much for coming along to our very, very first Port Fairy Literary Weekend. This has been a whole lot of fun to pull together, and I couldn't have worked with a more exciting crowd of authors. First up, we have Brett Clarke. He's going to do a few songs for us and introduce the evening. I need to thank everyone who's here tonight, obviously, all of the authors, and my husband, who's gone along with everything that I've suggested. Yes, and also a big thanks to Brett, who's graciously given his time tonight. And a thank you to COVID for letting this happen.
Natanamai everyone, how you all going? It's good to be here in Port Fairy. The traditional name of Port Fairy is Payipgil, and the Payipgil Gunditj lived in this region since the beginning of time. I grew up in the Warrnambool area, learning stories from my grandfather, who was born in a bark hut at the Old Pernham Bush, the Framingham Mission. And I spent, lots of my teenage years. I pretty much packed my bags and moved out to his place in my early teens. And it was such a special time for me, watching Pop make his wood carvings and listening to the beautiful stories of when he grew up in the forest, learning from the old people. The bush and the old people were his school. So he had an old horse and cart, so we used to travel around the forest. He'd teach me and my brother a lot about the medicinal plants of the area, and hearing great stories of, dreaming stories of, the little creatures that live in the forest, the little nets and things like that. So yeah, a magical time. Also obviously learning the hardship stories. Pop being born in the 1920s under lots of oppression. Supposedly they set up the missions in the early days to protect the Aborigines, as they say. So, because there was obviously a lot of bloodshed all through this area, and it's my passion to teach. Since his passing back in 2000, I continued his teachings and the stories, and I do a lot of school talks and various functions, festivals and things. So yeah, it's important to continue these teachings, because when I went to school, there wasn't much being taught about Indigenous lifestyle and the true history. It was always swept under the carpet, and me and the other Aboriginal kids, we were kicked out of the history class because we were disputing what was being taught. But now I'm happily, working with schools and helping to create a true cultural Indigenous history, And there's many different components to that. We've got NAIDOC week coming up, which is Heal Country, Heal Nation. So, our old people, we had our own religion, our own society, our own systems happening before colonisation arrived in our homelands. You know, people talk a lot about the birth of Victoria in the 1800s. Well, let me tell you, in this area, it was a birthplace of something of such a great spirit and such a proud race of people. You know, we have dreaming stories, some of the oldest dreaming stories in the world. You know, and I've found that people are becoming more open to hearing these stories because the truth speaks straight from the heart, you know, of the original custodians of this area, the Peak Barong, the Payup Girl Gunditj. So Payup Girl meaning, you know, the little coastal plant, pig face with the pink flowers. So that's the Payup Girl Gunditj. They're named after that. And I have a descendant directly from this tribe here, and I have lots of connections all the way back to Tasmania through my pop's mum's side. He was connected to the little lady from down Tasmania, Queen Truganini. And, you know, our history is all oral history. We never really wrote down things, but we had some magical places in this area, you know, from stone carvings, stone arrangements. You know, we've got stone arrangements older than the pyramids. And we've got great stories, you know, the redreaming, the reconnecting to country. You know, we've got stories of other nations coming here before the Europeans arrived. We've got stories of the Egyptians coming through the area to learn great spiritual knowledge of our old people. You know, we've, we had trade links with other world nations. So I'm happy to come and open with a couple of songs tonight. I've been writing songs for a few years now. In my early teens, we had a bit of a piano at home, so I was always making noise on the piano, annoying mum while she's watching the news or something. And so I started teaching myself the piano. I was lucky enough to sell a painting in an exhibition in my early teens, and I bought my first guitar, so I started mucking around, doing little bass runs, and so I'm a self-taught guitarist. I've been writing since my early teens. I get a lot of release from writing down my emotions and my feelings and the great stories that, you know, that have been handed down for generations. This first one is about a gathering, so it's full moon tonight. There used to be many great gatherings on the full moon in this area. You know, the old people would send smoke signals. They'd even send out little message sticks, and they'd be passed on like a baton. So the gatherings, one of them being out up Coolor. That's a old volcano there up towards Penshurst. So there was great gatherings happening there on full moon nights. A lot of ceremonial. What a magical time that would be. And I always sit back, you know, in my dreaming space, and I reflect upon these different areas, and what a magical place. So I seen a rainbow at night, and I came up with this song called Looking Through the Rainbow. It's about the full moon gatherings the smoke signals, the fire. Yeah.
The fire is lit, smoke is rising, the signal is here, your moon is there. Get moving, people. Sing and share, look into the rainbow. Can you see the stars above, shining to the treetops? Can you see the beam of light? To the future of our existence, it will come naturally, flow from your heart. You will see all the wonderful things we can do. Come on, my people, it's up to me and you. Look into the rainbow. Can you see the star above? Shining to the treetops. Can you see the beam of light in the darkness of the night? I know my way and I know what is right. Stand strong for the survival fight. I feel my heartbeat is one with motherland. Lift your spirit, let your spirit fly. We're all bundles, people, we walk without head high. Eternal life for you and me. Through the animal's eye, we will see. Yeah, look into the rainbow. Can you see the stars above? Shining to the treetops. Can you see the beam of light?
Thank you. Do you want to learn a bit of a language song? Think you can do it? Yeah, I reckon you can. So can you say Valavanana? Ooh, close. We'll try that again. Valavanana. That's better. And then Kunawanana. Kuna Wanana. And then Vala Wanana, Kuna Wanana. Beauty. You've got the words. I'm sure you'll pick up on the English part. But let's run through it again. Vala Wanana, Kuna Wanana, Vala Wanana, Kuna Wanana. Beauty. This was taught to my mum growing up on the old mission, taught to her by her grandmother in secret. So Vala Wanana, you can be my lovely choir. He sends a rainbow, a lovely rainbow. He sends a rainbow, give the rain. Vala Wanana, Kuna Wanana, Vala Wanana. We've got to do this one really quiet because someone's sleeping up the back. Vala Wanana, Kuna Wanana, Vala Wanana, Kuna Wanana. Thank you, everyone. You just learnt one of the oldest languages in the world. So thank you. Welcome to Payipgil Gunditj country on Peak Barong. Yeah, peace and goodwill, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so very much, Brett. That was wonderful. So if you want to get a drink, you could probably jump up and grab one. Okay, part two.
Mic check.
Are we right up the back there?
Ooh.
Okie dokie. I think we could probably nearly get started there. So, from left to right, we have Matt Neal, journalist from Warrnambool, ABC, and an author himself in his own right. He has a wonderful book called The Bay of Martyrs, which will be coming to our shores again soon, yes?
Yes.
Yes.
It really does exist. It's finally coming out again.
Yay! Yeah. So we'll have another launch or something for you.
Yeah, totally.
And then next to Matt, we have Kate Hall from Freshwater Creek. She's written the book From Darkness. And then Dmetri Kakmi, all the way from Williamstown. And I'll leave them to you. Thank you.
Thanks for coming out late. This is late, people in the front. It's actually good that this is happening, after, good people have gone to bed, because we're going to be talking about otherworldly things and the supernatural and the unexplained and horror and scary things. So someone did ask me earlier, is this going to be scary? I hope so. Sorry, Dean.
The terror begins.
Anyway, that's the sound check. So to everyone who's come here tonight, thank you very much for coming along. For those of you listening, this is a podcast as well. For those of you listening at home or driving in your car or while you're vacuuming, this is a good time to listen to a podcast. Welcome. Tonight we are talking about otherworldly things with Kate Hall, who has written this book, From Darkness, which is a YA novel that has a wonderful romance at its heart, as well as being a deep dive, both physically and metaphorically, into the Greek underworld and all things mythological. And we're also joined by Dmetri Kakmi, who has written this collection of short stories called The Door, which has, if you think horror is just one thing, you need to read this because it will show you that horror and scary things, there is a whole bunch of subgenres within horror, and this book covers a lot of them. So can you please make welcome Kate Hall and Dmetri Kakmi. So the first question that I wanted to ask you both, given these books are both a little bit scary in different ways, yours, Dmetri, is very scary in a lot of ways, but a lot of really wrong ways, but we'll get to that in a minute. But I want to know, starting with you first, Kate, but what scares you?
Ooh, you mean apart from spiders?
Well, that's a good start, but yes.
Spiders scare everybody.
Yeah.
What scares me the most? I think what scares me is the inexplicable. Because I wouldn't say that I'm an empiricist, but I do like to know what's going on, and that I can see things. Things are tangible. When you can't quite grasp something, you know, the uncanny scares me. Dmetri's book scares me. Yeah. So something that you can't explain, something that you catch out of the corner of your eye. You know, weird coincidences. But they scare and delight me in equal measure, I think.
One thing I love in your book is there's a scene where the young people who have been seeing all this incredibly strange and bizarre things happen, and they actually sit down with the grown-up and explain, this is what's been going on. And usually in these kind of things, the kids just kind of like keep it all hidden or whatever, and the grown-ups are completely oblivious. But in your book, they actually sit down and explain it, and the adult has to sit there and understand it, and it is explained. And that's, I found that really fascinating. But that kind of, is that partly because you're afraid of the inexplicable? You wanted the adult to sit there and understand it?
I think the problem is with young adult fiction, I mean, rule number one, you get rid of the parents in some way. But if you don't kill them outright, then eventually they're going to come back. So the mum in my story does come home, and she's fine, like she's alive. And so if the protagonists are going to have further adventures, then they need clearance in some way, because by this part of the narrative, everyone's in this kind of weird lockdown. You know, you can't go outside because you're going to get completely mauled to death by these packs of wild dogs that are roaming the pine plantation. So they're under this benign form of house arrest because they're only teenagers. So I think the motivation for telling the mum in the story was to actually try and attain a degree of freedom, thinking that, you know, knowledge is power, but it doesn't really work like that. In fact, what happens is the mum just says, well, that's all the more reason not to let you out, really, you know, if this is true, which she's pretty good at believing crazy stuff. And also Ari, my main character, comes back from the underworld with hair that's like 6 inches longer than when her mother last saw her.
And she's been missing for months.
She's been missing, she's dishevelled.
It's pretty hard to explain all that away, really.
It is a little.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I did like that you actually went and, you know what, we're just going to lay all this out. It was quite a relief.
It's always good to tell the truth. Remember that, kids?
Yes. Kids, if you're listening at home, tell the truth. Especially my son, if you're listening. 5-year-old.
That's not the advice Dmetri would give.
Well, Dmetri, what scares you?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've never thought about it.
You've written about a whole heap of different scary shit in your book. So.
I know, but I've never actually thought about that particular question. So you're putting me on the spot. So I'm just trying to think, when I watch, say, a horror movie, what scares me? So the sorts of stuff I tend to stay away from horror films is realistic stuff. Like, I can't bear films about serial killers. I don't like films about cannibalism, so no zombies for me. So cannibalism is a big one.
Don't you have a cannibalistic serial killer in your book?
Yes. And extreme violence really, really terrifies me. But I think in terms of answering the question more directly, I would have to say possibly for me there's nothing scarier than the human brain, the human mind, I should say. I think when we begin to delve into how other people view the world, how they experience the world, can be very, very frightening. And that's really what I'm doing with these stories. I think if I had to break it down, in a sense, what I was doing with The Door and the other stories in this collection is trying to seduce readers with words into my world and trap them in my head and say, this is what I live with every day. Now you're trapped in it as well.
That is terrifying. I'm going to ask you
So
to
really,
leave.
it's the human mind.
Well, in both your books, horrible things happen to children. Is that because you're both horrible people?
I can't speak for Dmetri,
I don't
but
think
yes.
Katie.
No, I'm fascinated by the idea of everyone's scared by different things, and everyone has a line where things are sort of too much. So how do you determine in your books where the line is? Especially for you, Kate, you're writing for a younger audience. So how do you know where the line is of where stuff is too scary or too much for a young audience? How do you figure out where that line is?
I don't know that I sort of set boundaries when I was writing it, and I've been told since that it is actually quite scary. And at the time that I was writing those, the scenes with the dogs, for instance, or Lord Acheron from the underworld, who's quite horrible and nasty and does awful things to the main characters, I didn't really feel like I was being frightening. But if I was to draw a line, it would be, and I'm sorry to get really heavy here for a moment, sexual violence of any kind, kidnapping, incarceration. So for me, the supernatural is probably, as Dmetri just said, less scary than the real life violence that exists in the world, because it seems a bit removed, because we can distance ourselves a bit from it.
Did you give any thought to, because you're writing a YA novel, did you give any thought to how young people might react to some of the stuff in it though? I mean, did you not think, sorry, this sounds really dumb now, but, I mean, there's not quite kidnapping in there, but there's people held against their will.
Absolutely, yes.
There's the threat of people being married off against their will.
Children at that.
Children as
being
well.
married
Yeah.
off.
Yeah, now that I think about it.
Yeah.
Well, also, I think YA is always about high stakes. Everything is heightened. Love is heightened. Love is not just love. Love is transcendent love. Love is going to be the love that you have forever. Because I think when we're that age, that's what we believe. We truly believe that. And so, also, danger is heightened. Everything is heightened. I remember being the age that my characters are, being 16, 17. And I think that readers of that age can deal with those threats in an intelligent way, and more than that, we just don't give them enough credit. What's important is how that's dealt with, and the overcoming of that, and the assurance that yes, there's a threat, but there's also always a way to combat it. And it's usually about accessing some courage or some inner strength, and also accepting help from outside. So, you use the basic quest format, and there is help there if you choose to accept it. But in the end, what we will defeat, the powers of darkness, is the inner reserves that you can mobilize when necessary. Courage being probably the most important, I think. So yeah, I think I thought about it, but I didn't worry that it would scare people, because, and I know that my daughters read similar narratives all the time, and in fact worse things happen in some of the books that I know that they read. So I think if we underestimate YA readers and what they can deal with, we're doing them a disservice.
I was going to ask you this later on, but you've led into it. Did you talk to your daughters about what they were reading and whether the stuff you were pitching was, you know, hitting in the same ballpark, whether you'd gone too far or whether you could go further?
All the time. All the time. There's so much of them in the book because I would ask questions about, does this work? Is this plausible? And they always had sage advice, and I followed it, and I'm really glad that I did.
We should ask your kids about this. Maybe we'll do that a bit later on. Dmetri, your book, obviously the line is probably a bit further out. I would say a fair distance, several kilometres out, I would say. But how do you know where the line is too, that you're not... I mean, you mentioned horror movies with, you know, great graphic violence. I remember quite like the first Saw film, but watching the subsequent sequels, I remember getting partway through Saw 2 or Saw 3 and actually turning off and thinking, well, if your objective is to repulse me completely, you've won, director. And so how do you not get to the point where you're making people go, well, I can't read this and put it down?
I suspect I have more freedom than Kate in terms of you're writing young adult stuff. I used to edit young adult books at Penguin, so we'd often have these discussions. Has this author gone too far? But I'm writing for adults.
There's still a point for adults as well too.
I don't have that line. I have no lines. There's absolutely nothing I would not write. As you see, Haunting Matilda, the final story in there, is pretty extreme. There's, you know, a physical and sexual abuse of a child. That's a pretty extreme story, and there are others in there, but I think that's probably as far as it goes. So I actually have no lines. I would write anything. So because basically I don't... When I write fiction, I don't begin from a premise of frightening or scaring a reader. My ideas really come... A character comes to me and says, Dmetri, write, this is who I am, write my story. So my first obligation is to the character and to the story. So whatever it is that they tell me to write, I will write it.
So if they come to you and say, do horrible things,
yeah,
that's what you do.
I have no line, I'm afraid. Yeah. And I think, and a lot of it, I think, is, to be more practical about it, is my writing tends to be very, very personal, very, very subjective. It actually comes from my own personal experiences. For anyone who's read my first book, Motherland, which is a memoir of my family's final years in Turkey, if you read that book and then you read The Door, you will see precisely where the stories in The Door come from. Actually, a reader of The Door recently sent me an email, and she said probably the most incisive thing about this book. She said, I was hoping you would write a sequel to The Motherland. And after reading The Door, she said, I realised you have written a sequel, but what you've done is you've taken all the themes, the major themes from Motherland, and put them through David Lynch's Dark Lodge. And spot on. So really, I have no boundaries.
So why is it important to tell scary stories then? If you have no line, or you're not too concerned about the line or anything, why do we tell these stories? What's the function? Why? And we'll start with you, Dmetri. Why put together an anthology of scary stuff? Or more to the point, why write a bunch of scary things? What do you see as the function of that? Why are we attracted to that?
Well, you see, I suspect different genre writers will have different responses. But my primary concern is I have a deep and abiding need to express certain things about my childhood. So I really don't have an option. And for various reasons, I am drawn primarily to the supernatural and to the uncanny and to the gothic. I could trace all that stuff back to my own childhood again. So for me, it's not really a matter of writing scary stories, I'm not interested in scaring readers. Partly because I think if you try to scare readers, you're on very dangerous ground. You're not going to scare them, because different things scare different people. You know, what scares me doesn't scare you. What I try to do in my fiction is really try to pull the rug out from under the reader very, very, very slowly until they find themselves on unstable ground, where they begin to question the nature of reality and perception. As you know, you've read the stories. Primarily they deal with characters who lose a grip on reality, and they begin to question, what is reality, what is fantasy? Are they the same thing? Are they different things? Are they different sides of the same coin? So really that's primarily what I'm dealing with.
Well, the question is then, why is it good to do that? Why do you want to do that?
I reckon there's a primal need for us, don't you think? You know, to write stories like this. It takes us into uncharted territory in life, really. Certainly when, speaking from my own personal experience, when I sit down to read a horror novel or a gothic novel or watch a horror movie, for me, and actually I'd love to know how you feel about this. For me, it's like I'm addicted. I have to have my horror fix at least 3 times a week, otherwise I get the shakes. So for me, it's an addiction, and it's familiar and comforting territory for me to go there.
This is a brain chemical thing, I think.
It is for me.
Yeah.
My therapist reckons it's because of all the shit that I went through with in my childhood. This is recognisable territory, so it makes me feel comforted. I'm not quite sure about the theory, but we're still dealing with that.
Right. I feel like your chair should be a couch that I asked you to lie on. But Kate,
So do you feel the same way?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think that my book's a bit more. When I'm using, I guess, and I hesitate to call it horror because I don't think it's horror, but when I'm using scary elements in my story, what you're describing seems to me to be in the mode, and many of the novella and many of the stories in the door are quite fantastic. So, you know, Svetlana Todorov would say that, you know, these are fantastic tales. What I was trying to do was something much more akin to magical realism in a way. So it's set in the real world, and then you have another plane of existence entirely that is accessed through portals. But really, the problem is not that the two are enmeshed, but that when the two worlds are able to come together, and when the darkness bleeds out of the underworld into the world of the living, that's when you have a problem, and that's when it needs to be resolved. Everything's neatly closed off, and this goes to what I was saying before about YA needing to have a resolution that I think, that, you know, not necessarily happy endings. Although I think with books that have queer characters, happy endings are extremely important. I'm not interested in reading books that don't have happy endings, that have, you know, same-sex romance in them. But that's different to having that ambivalence and that, as you say, pulling the rug out from under the reader. You know, I don't know where I am. Am I in reality? With the novella, with The Door, I still don't know who the real, you know, who is actually the real character, who's in the painting and who's outside, and that's profoundly unsettling.
You see, that's the thing that I noticed when I finished reading your novel. The thing that gave me great comfort was you resolve everything. You close off the door, whereas all my stories are really open-ended.
Yes.
There's an ambiguity, not only as to has anything really been resolved here, but is this an ongoing thing?
Yeah.
Or, you know, so I always leave an open-ended, ambiguous ending, because that's how I see life.
I have I think Acheron is still out there. I think the big bad evil guy in your book, Kate, is still out there and comes back in a sequel.
Maybe.
He's my favourite character in the book. I loved him.
He's
I
just
would
so
so
nasty,
be dating him No problem.
Well, did you notice he's kind of hotter in the underworld than he is
sure
in the world
did
of living?
notice that. Don't worry, Kate, I noticed.
But Kate, your book is using Greek mythology that's been around for thousands of years. It's probably served a storytelling function thousands of years ago, and you're using it again. I mean, why do you think these kind of these mythologies or these kind of stories keep coming around again? Why do we keep telling these stories?
Oh, that's a big question. I think one of the things as a white Australian, as a non-Indigenous Australian person, is that those stories felt like stories that I have access to, that I'm allowed to tell, because they seem like they belong to everybody. So that was one reason for using that particular kind of underworld mythology. But I think that when you're writing myth and you're using those very recognisable stories, there are a few ways that you can go. You can rehearse the same old stories and you can be familiar, or you can take it in slightly different directions. And what I wanted to do was to give the female characters in the underworld quite a lot more power. So the three fates end up having the deciding vote in what happens. And the judges, the male judges of the underworld, and even Acheron himself, who's brought to bay in the courtroom scene by the kind of implacable will and authority of the three female fates, that felt to me hopefully a little bit different and a bit of a variation on some of the ways in which those myths are normally told. And I got rid of Persephone and Hades because I think that's kind of been done, and Eurydice, and so I hoped that I took all the usual stuff and kind of just pushed it to the side and then tried to play with some characters that don't normally get a lot of airtime. But now I'm wishing that I had made Acheron a woman, actually, because that might have been much more interesting.
That's a very interesting idea.
Yeah.
Tell me, did you, given the fact that your book is set in Australia, did you actually consider incorporating Indigenous stories and mythologies into this? So why did you not do that?
Because I am not an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander Australian, and I don't have access to those stories, and I don't.
See, I would do it. I would have no problem doing it.
You would have no problem. I just can't. I don't think that it's my place.
But
it's very tricky territory. It can be very problematic.
Well, I'm just playing devil's advocate here because I loved your book, but why do you feel you can do it with Greek mythology? Because you're not Greek, so why do you feel you can do it with Greek? Did you write to the Greek government and ask them for permission?
This is a very, very difficult question, and it's not something that I decided to do lightly either. Originally, I was going to use Celtic mythology because that is my heritage, and that's something that I felt that I maybe had the authority to access. But in the end, it didn't work. It didn't work for what I needed the story to do. I don't know that I have a better answer than that, because I don't think there's ever going to be a better answer than that. It's just going to be endless questions and decisions that are going to have outcomes that are not satisfactory no matter what.
You've obviously thought about mythology and all of these things before writing this book. You said maybe it was going to be Celtic. You thought about Indigenous and crossed that out. But where's your interest in otherworldly things or the supernatural come from? Can you remember a point where you were like, this is fascinating, I want to
Absolutely.
write about it?
The novels that I read when I was a young adult. And so, for instance, things like, and I've used a few of these titles in the book, something called The Owl Service.
I love that book so much.
I know, it's so good. By Alan Garner. What else did I read and just couldn't put down? Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising series. Anything at all by Ursula Le Guin.
Yes.
What else did I... And I just devoured all of this stuff. So I think that the things that we absorb as young readers stay with us, and they become something that then feels very natural when you start to write. Oh, I will do this. And maybe that answers the question about the Greek mythology stuff as well, because what Susan Cooper, for example, does with the Arthurian material, other writers, whose names of course now escape me while I'm sitting up here, were doing with the classical stuff in some of the other young adult novels that I read as a teen. So yeah, I think it became a very natural thing to do, was to then do that when I started to write my own book.
And you see, I totally understand that, because my influences are in fact English. They're not Greek or Turkish.
Did you write to the English government to ask?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I didn't write to them, because when I came to Australia and started learning to, read and write English, I was reading British writers from the 50s and 60s. And they are the influence. The tone of voice and the style of writing in my work comes from them. So really, what are we talking about? Algernon Blackwood, Susan Hill, etc., are the influences for this book. Although I think Susan Hill probably passed out if she read my book, but still.
So, where did your interest in horror come from? Then, where do your horror, antecedents?
I really don't know, because I started reading fantasy and horror as soon as we came to Australia. The books that I started picking up to read were Enid Blyton and C.S. Lewis fantasy. Then I graduated to Stephen King and various other British horror writers like Graham Masterton, someone called Campbell. And then I went. No, he's the mythologist. He's the
hero's
mythologist.
Journey. Yeah, someone yelled out Joseph Campbell. Yeah.
And then I went further back to Algernon Blackwood, M.R. James, etc., etc. So they're really the influences. But in terms of answering the question properly, I grew up on a small Turkish island in which Greek as well as Middle Eastern fables and characters and mythologies were very, very much alive. I mean, yes, our culture was a combination of Muslim and Greek orthodoxy, but the pagan elements were very, very much alive. So I grew up in a place where it was commonplace for people to say, I saw a jinn today, or I saw the god Pan playing his pipes in such and such grove. So I grew up in that environment. So for me it was real. It was not to be questioned. So I'm continuing a tradition that is inbuilt.
In your book, Dmetri, there are all the stories, and I hinted at this at the start, that all the stories feel like a different horror subgenre. I mean, The Door reminded me of Picture of Dorian Gray. Yeah. There's a gothic kind of element to it. Hang on, I'm going to refer to my list here. You've got a Cthulhu story, like a Lovecraftian story. You've got the one that's set in Port Fairy, is more of a classic ghost story.
Yes.
Like
that's M.R. James influence.
Yeah. And then you have is it the Long Road?
The Long Lonely Road. Yeah.
It feels like almost like a fable kind of a thing as well.
It's actually a Turkish fable that I grew up with.
Yeah. So, were you conscious of pulling this together, that you touched on all these different things, or that have you been aware that that horror is not just one thing; it is many different kind of subgenres, or did any of that sort of crossed your mind?
No, it didn't, because I don't know that we actually think about these things when we write them. I think it's quite an unconscious process, but. 3 of the stories in the collection were previously published and they were commissioned. So I wrote to order, basically. So that's the Cthulhu story you mentioned. The Long Lonely Road was for a Croatian magazine. And The Boy by the Gate was commissioned for a British Gothic anthology. It came out 2013 or something. So they were commissioned pieces. So I didn't really think about them in those terms. And the other 3 were written specifically for this anthology. You see, my attitude to the genre is that it's a great misunderstood genre. People go, oh, it's horror. It can be easily dismissed. It's trash, it's pulp, people can giggle about it. In fact, it has a very noble tradition. When we look at its beginnings with, Mary Shelley, Stevenson with Bram Stoker and Dr. Jekyll and Hyde, which is my favourite. They came from a very solid sort of literary background. Not so much Bram Stoker, perhaps, but certainly there are others. And some of the best practitioners and the ones that we remember the most nowadays are really high literary writers. One of my favourites is the American writer Shirley Jackson from the 1950s and 60s. I love that woman. When you read The Haunting of Hill House, and particularly her final novel, this woman takes all the rules of novel writing and chucks them out of the window and puts together something that just makes you go, wow, who on earth are you? How did you come to write this? So for me, it's a noble tradition that I simply desire to sort of continue and add to. So I never really think about those questions. I reckon if I thought of those questions, it would stop me from writing the sort of stuff that I do. Yeah, so it's not a conscious thing for me.
Is it maybe a subconscious thing where you go, well, all these stories feel different, so they can fit together in a way, perhaps? Is that maybe a more subconscious way of looking at it?
I think one of the... I've been very lucky with it all. I've had some really fantastic reviews. One review in The Age really kicked my ass. And she was horrible. And she said that none of the stories work, that they lack psychological depth, they don't work together as a collection, etc., etc. So who the hell knows? Who the hell knows?
Our critics, says the film reviewer. Kate, your story, it kind of sits in two worlds of being mythological and it's not a horror story, but it is on the scary side. We're dealing with the underworld. We're dealing with death. Death is a very prominent theme and feature in it. But you're also hitting into YA, where I feel like this kind of stuff is more accepted in some way. There's YA about zombies and and Greek mythology. I mean, like Percy Jackson? I keep going to say this and it's getting, thank you.
Yeah.
Your children are nodding at me, so I'm taking that as a good sign. That kind of stuff is used in YA. So do you feel like that it's either there's difficult to find new ground in there, or that maybe that it feels like a lot of things have been done before in there, or how do you try and... Did you give any kind of thought, or is it much like Dmetri, just not thinking about those kind of aspects?
Yeah, no, I don't think you can. I think if you start trying to guess in advance what your intertextual connections or your literary antecedents are, you're just going to get stymied. And what's really delightful is that then when readers come and say, oh, I love the way that, you connected with this. And I'm quite surprised when people say, that they recognise something that I hadn't even thought about
and they
when
see
I was writing
things
it.
in your stuff that you wouldn't have seen.
And then I think that sometimes I see, and I don't go back and, I don't know if you do, but I don't read my own work after I've written it. I just, once it's out there, it's out there. But if I have to talk about it, at an event or something, it sometimes feels like therapy in a way, because I do have to think about certain aspects of it, and then there'll be like this revelation that, I actually didn't know that I was connecting with, I don't know who it was, but let's say, Joseph Campbell's a good
Joseph Campbell.
We'll pick on Joseph Campbell. So, I didn't know that I'd written sort of a classic quest structure into the book until a friend of mine said, I like the quest structure, like the 3 part.
You do refer
really?
to that towards the end about how a lot of the stories have the same kind of... You kind of refer to Joseph Campbell's theory there.
Yeah, but I was thinking about fairy tales, and I wasn't thinking about Joseph Campbell until somebody suggested it. So I think that's part of the magic of writing. If you set out to say, I'm going to write a novel and use Joseph Campbell's classic quest structure,
You're bound to fail.
That's right, you're just setting yourself up for a fall.
One of the things, I worked at Penguin Books as a senior editor for 15 years, and one of the things I learned as an editor was the author is usually the last person you would ask what the book is about.
Yes.
They don't know.
No.
They tell you, go, really? That's not what your book's about. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
This is what the book is about.
That's right.
So I think it's a very complicated picture.
You did make a conscious decision, though, to leave out, you mentioned like Persephone and Eurydice and those kind of characters. So there must have been something going on of thinking, well, here's an not untapped, but here's an underread or underused area of Greek mythology. I mean, a lot of the characters that you're referring to, you know, I've read some of this kind of stuff in primary school, much like you did. And in fact, Enid Blyton has a great book of like old mythology stories, which is where I first read about Persephone and all those kind of things. But it seems you made a conscious decision to look at some of the other bits of that mythology, that, you know, around the Fates and Acheron, and that weren't so commonly referred to.
You know, I think I wanted the underworld to be a setting more than something that the characters walked into and then had to engage with people who were, or entities who were already living there. And if we're talking about, you know, intertexts and antecedents, the inspiration for the descent into the underworld came very much from the scene in, which one is it, in the Earthsea trilogy, where Jed goes down into the underworld for the first time.
I've only read the first two.
Anyway, the way that Le Guin writes this is that it's like a long sloping hill, I suppose, and then at the bottom there's a wall, a very low wall. And once you cross over that wall, then you are in the realm of the dead. And it is absolutely terrifying. And there's nothing else to it than that, just a very grey, featureless hillside with a low wall at the bottom, and that's all that she needed to do. And I loved that, the simplicity of that. And okay, you asked what scared me. I didn't think about it until now. I don't like confined spaces. I don't like tunnels. I don't like being trapped. I had a terrible experience as a child. In Bowen Heads, there's a tunnel on the bluff. I don't know if people know the bluff in Bowen Heads. And the thing to do as a kid was to dare each other to crawl through the tunnel. And you would eventually, you know, pop out the other side. But it narrows to a point where you have to go through on your stomach. Yeah, I know.
And you have a scene of that in your book.
There you go.
And it's the most terrifying sequence in the book.
Yeah, there's lots of stuff going on about, I mean, paging Dr. Freud, right? Tunnels. And anyway, but that is really, really terrifying. So the underworld for me offered the opportunity to create those kinds of settings. And another novel that I love so much and find incredibly inspiring and read over and over again is a novel called The Changeover by Margaret Mayhew, which also has like a transformation scene, so that the central character turns herself into a witch in this novel, but she has to be reborn in order to do that, and there's a tunnel in that scene as well where you have to emerge. So it's sort of like a rebirth. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I can't even remember what the question
No,
was, to
me
be honest.
neither.
How are we going for time, Joe? Oh, yeah, we're about there. I might just ask one more quick one of each of you. There's, not so much a question, but more just a thing to point people to. But in the door, you point to Dmetri that there's an essay you wrote about writing the door, which is online. That was for a podcast, I believe. You don't know. But the essay is great and talks about how this short story, how long did it end up being initially?
Which story are you talking about? Is it The Door?
Yeah, I think it's The Door.
No, The Door was...
A short essay on how The Door came to be written can be found at www.thedunkenodyssey.com.
Nice.
And it talks about, and it's called How Not to Write a Short Story.
Oh, yes. I was commissioned to write a short story for a small publishing house here in Australia. She said 2,000 words. And I said, yeah, sure. And then delivered The Door. And she went, no, I'm not very good with short stories. I think my ideas are too big. I think I have trouble sort of encompassing it in 3,000 or 4,000 words. I'm not very good at it. I actually don't think I'm a very successful short story writer. They always turn into novels.
Except for the 6 you've put in this one.
Which is surprising.
Yeah. And Kate, one last question for you from me before we open it up to the intent audience. Attentive, not intent. What am I saying? Jesus. You did mention that your daughters had said a lot about what they were reading and, you know, what worked for them and what didn't. Can you give some examples of that, of the sage wisdom that came from your offspring?
So many. Okay, so first of all, one of the things that they said that really stands out is that you don't want things to be too predictable in young adult fiction because then it's boring, right? But if you ignore the tropes altogether, it moves that story out of the genre entirely, or out of what is recognisable and therefore pleasurable and fun about YA. And I'm writing something at the moment that my eldest has told me is way too terrifying and therefore doesn't belong in that category at all. But I can't pinpoint little things, details. So, you know, when describing characters, how much is too much? How much should you leave to the imagination? And the thing about parents is very important.
What thing about parents? Get them out of the way.
You've got to get rid of them.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, how do your characters have any kind of agency or adventure or the potential to get themselves into trouble?
Yep.
There's just parents are no
Kill
fun.
them off.
You can kill them, I mean, but everyone kills them off.
Yeah,
so sometimes it's nice to...
That's why Harry Potter doesn't have parents. Yeah.
Orphans.
Yeah.
Classic orphans, yeah.
Yep. Standing by with the microphone. Who's got some questions for our authors? Because if not, I'm just going to keep asking questions until midnight. So, anyone have a question?
They're shy.
They are. Oh, yeah, there we go. This is all COVID safe, this microphone too, just so you know.
When you, Matt, asked the question of both our speakers before of why do you write scary stories, and you touched on childhood experiences, do you, for someone who probably avoids scary things purposely to stick my head in the sand, and I admit that, do you think it is healthier to talk about them even if it is fictitious?
To talk about scary stories in general?
Yeah.
Like, so can horror be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, for you personally, do you find it, for a better word, cathartic? But perhaps you say you have that like adrenaline rush that you love to watch and read things 3 times a week. Is that because it does feel better afterwards?
I'll answer that question in a slightly different way. One of the really good reviews that we had for The Door, it was, interestingly enough, in a great newspaper, but published in English. The reviewer called my stories bulk and bleak. And I thought, wow, I wish I'd thought of that. And he hit the nail on the head, because what he basically sort of elucidated on is, he said, these aren't horror stories. They're not Lovecraftian stories. They're not ghost stories. They're basically the stories that our Balkan, our Greek, our Turkish grandmothers grew up hearing around the fireplace when they were growing up. These are stories that offer no consolation. They're basically saying, this is what the real world is like. Get ready for it. You're going to go out there and face it. And I thought, man, you've so hit it on the head. And in fact, we're using that review as the introduction to the book if it gets another edition. Yeah, so that's really where I sort of come from. I actually derive comfort from them. I don't know if you do, but I derive comfort.
Well, can I just twist that question a little bit for you, Kate? But do you think it's important for young people to maybe read stuff that's a little bit on the scarier side at an early age to kind of, I don't know, wean them onto scarier things and the real world? I don't know.
Yeah, I have 2 excellent quotes that speak to this. The first is from Bart Simpson in the episode where he and Lisa are watching a horror film, and she's covering her eyes, and Bart's pulling her hands away and saying, if you don't watch, how are you going to get desensitized? Which is a good point.
Oh, that's great.
And the other more serious quote is by Kafka, who says that, you know, if we get too comfortable, then we're not doing ourselves any favours. He says books should bite and sting us. You know, they should be, literature should be an axe for the frozen sea within us. So I think if we exclude young readers from that, we're shutting off a whole realm that's important. But I also don't know that it's necessary to scare young readers on purpose either. And that definitely wasn't my intention. My book is a love story. But I think like all good love stories, if there's not something difficult, if it's not hard, if there isn't something that needs to be overcome, then everything becomes a bit safe and a bit too comfortable and maybe a bit boring.
Well, it's a lot about context, isn't it? I mean, the fact yours is dealing with death, but it is, as you said, it's a love story. And perhaps the greatest, thing that confronts love can be death, potentially. I mean, that all works. And it's not necessarily deliberately being scary. It's stakes, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's like the Little Prince and the Fox, right? If you choose to love something, and you choose to love something with everything that you have, then the greatest fear and the greatest horror and something that can't come at you from the outside because you've made it yourself is the fear of loss. That's the terrifying thing. That's the stuff we dance around, I think.
And it's a love story that really triumphs over death.
Yes.
Yours. That's the thing that I love most about it, because I thought, how is she going to pull this off? And the fact that it's two female protagonists who are in love really, for me, transcended all of it. It simply stopped being a normal love story and a normal fantasy, and it simply became something else. So, yeah.
Thank you for that question.
Says the fan.
Do we have another question from the floor? Oh, yes. Oh, there's one right there, very close.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi. You said earlier that, sorry, this is for Dmetri. You said earlier that you like to leave your stories open-ended. Do you ever ask yourself what happens?
Yes. The door.
That's a great question.
The Door has a prequel in the story. It's called... Damn, I just forgot what it's called. It's the third story in the book, is the prequel. So when The Door finished, that character stayed in my mind for a very, very long time. And I thought, he has a whole life. But when I sat down to write that other life, it actually ended up being the story before The Door actually opens. So I tend to work backwards rather than forwards with stories, because I'm very interested in the psychology of characters. How did you end up in this place? And in order to do that, you need to look back, in my view. And while I've been in Port Fairy, I've come up with a sequel to The Boy by the Gate. So there will be a sequel to The Boy by the Gate.
Are you going on one of the Port Fairy ghost tours that are happening
No.
this weekend, Dmetri?
No.
Too scary?
I will be one of the ghosts.
Well, just following up on that for you, Kate, yours isn't open-ended, but I did think that this had the potential for sequels. Have you thought about more books in this series?
Oh, I did originally plan that it might be a duology or a trilogy. But I have this terrible curse, which is that I tend to then want to write something different and something new.
Yeah.
You're with me on this. So yeah, I'd love to write a sequel, but I'm really engaged in what I'm doing at the moment, which is completely different. I'm writing a dystopian thriller. So it feels like Ari and Alex and Acheron and everybody else that's there in Stonehaven, they can just sit for a bit and do their thing. But I don't think about them all that much. I think about Dmetri's little boy ghost much more than I do about my own characters. And it's because your stories, they haunt the reader. yeah, we need to talk more about that.
I keep
yeah.
thinking about Akron coming back. So
Oh,
that's
do you?
good. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
And the hunter and his daughter.
Oh, the hunter.
There is a story there, woman.
Yeah,
You need to write it.
I know. Well, I have written the first few chapters.
Aha. I'm so
there
pleased
we
to
go.
hear that. He's a
Secret
great
comes out.
character.
There was a question up the front here, I believe.
Oh,
Do you want to, yeah, you go. I'm going to knock over things if I do that.
Thanks. I'm a bit of a horror fan. I don't like being scared in real life, but I love being scared in a movie, and I hate it at the same time. And I love Shirley Jackson. But I think we forget that how fun horror can be. I don't like horror comedy. I'm not into that.
I'm the
but
same.
I love. It's like going on a ride.
Yeah.
At the thing that horror doesn't have to be about bleakness, really.
There's a fabulous movie called Drag Me to Hell,
Yeah,
which is
Sam Raimi.
so funny and so bloody scary. It's a roller coaster ride, isn't it? And yeah, I love. And the Halloween movies are roller coaster rides as well.
Drag Me to Hell, that's Sam Raimi, who did the Evil Dead films, which are again they're hilarious at the same time as being scary as hell.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. But I can't do comedy with horror.
No,
There's something about my sensibility just can't go.
no one up for Shaun of the Dead? No?
Oh, Shaun of the
you.
Dead.
I love
Come
Thank
on.
you.
I
There
love
you-
that film.
Come on.
Yes. See, when you're talking absolutes like that, I've just got to shoot you down. So.
I love that film.
That was more of a statement than, yeah, that's
But that's
totally fine.
But then the other, I have read this brilliant book called 1,000 Women in Horror, and
That's a good book.
it's a great book, and the premise is like, but also women love horror because real life for a lot of women is worse than anything that you could make up.
For those listening on the podcast, that was off mic, but 1,000 Women in Horror is the name of the book, and because so real life is often worse for women than horror stories can actually be. So yes, good point.
And that's where the Gothic comes from, because a lot of the intended audience of the original Gothic were female readers. And the premise of original Gothic, like, the Horace Walpoles and the Anne Radcliffes and stuff, was that there was a female protagonist trapped in a house, and it was all about how she was going to escape and if she was going to escape.
But why do you think women are the ones who've made the genre their very own?
That's right.
It's precisely that.
That's right.
It's
all about
and
entrapment
Shirley
and the
Jackson and
Yep.
Susan Hill, etc., etc. It goes on and on.
Yes. Virginia Andrews. We're not going to
No,
go
I've
there.
never read.
We're not going to go there.
Flowers in the attic.
No.
Well, I wasn't going to go here, but there is an interesting point to be made. Both your books have gay protagonists in them who are going through horrible things, and so there's a whole discussion to be had around horror through a homosexual lens as well, isn't there? I mean, what do you feel like you're adding to the canon there, or is that something that you feel, or is it just a way of just normalizing things? And is that how you kind of addressed it in yours? Okay.
Absolutely. So, there are heaps of subgenres of YA now that have queer protagonists, and you would call them, thrillers, horror, etc. But for me, what was most important was that Ari and Alex's, sexual orientation, their love affair, and that's completely secondary, really, to the story itself. And it wasn't about them being gay or coming out or that being a problem, and that's why in the novel it's not even really a thing.
Yeah, it's not
an
discussed.
issue.
That's what's great about it. Yeah.
That's what we need more of.
Yeah.
I think.
And that's precisely what the two characters in The Door, who are gay men in a long-term relationship, it's not the issue.
No, it's the fact
The story, it's what
he's
actually
trapped behind a
happens to
door.
these
That's
people.
the thing. Yeah. Yeah, it's the fact he's trapped behind a door is the problem. Yeah.
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 Yes, but that's metaphoric.
I
though,
know.
isn't
Yes.
it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do we have another? Yes. Wait for the microphone.
So is there any difference between the female imagination and the male imagination? Then, the way what
You take over.
How does anyone answer that question?
I don't know. Does imagination have a gender? I don't
Yeah,
know.
because you're exploring the subconscious from two different perspectives. So
Well,
you're
then
exploring it through your prism, and
I think you've
Dmetri's
just answered your own
exploring it through
question then.
his. So I'm asking, is there in your...
I think that's a really interesting question. I think it's about how we experience the world, and so it comes down to a very individual set of circumstances. So, for instance, my example before about Gothic and women, you know, a young woman in the mid-1800s would experience the world very differently to perhaps a young woman would now in similar socio-cultural circumstances. But so the female imagination, if you want to call it that, in those days, like think of something like you know, the Brontes, right, like Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre, which are classic Gothic texts. These days, those same fears and anxieties might still be present in a lot of women's lives, but in a diluted form, depending on where you live and how you're situated and what kinds of particular oppressions you're dealing with. But I don't know. Your turn.
Have you finished?
Definitely.
Oh. I'm going to go out on a limb and say I do think there is a difference.
Right.
And I say this because when I read horror fiction, I am largely drawn to horror fiction written by women. And at some point I had to ask myself, why is this? And I find, when I read Shirley Jackson, Susan Hill, two of my favourites, I find that women's Gothic fiction tends to deal with interiority, the interior lives of characters, the emotional and psychological lives of characters in ways that male readers fail to do. Also, in particular with these two female writers that I mentioned, the writing has a texture and a quality that really appeals to me in ways that, say, Stephen King or Graham Masterton simply don't. They know how to tell a damn good yarn that gallops along. You go, I can't put this down. But the writing does nothing for me. And I come out of it thinking, oh, I actually don't feel as if I know this character. But Shirley Jackson's characters live with me every day of the week. I know these women. So I think there is a slight difference in the way women write. Maybe not think, perhaps, but certainly write.
Yeah, and if we can switch that to film for a minute, I don't know how many of you know the wonderful film by Anna Lilia Mirpour, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night.
Oh, I love that film so much.
So good. So again, you know, she's targeting a particular kind of experience that does. I'm changing my mind now in response to your question. I think imagination probably does is gendered, but it's gendered because of experience. And so that the reason that film works is because the protagonist is female and that she should be vulnerable, but in fact isn't. And by the way, if you don't like cannibal films, don't watch her cannibal film. Just don't watch The Bad Batch.
Oh yeah, I've avoided that film.
Don't watch it. Don't. It's bad. It'll traumatize you forever.
Not interested.
No one should watch it. So yeah, I think you're right. I think there is a difference.
Any further questions?
Well,
No,
we're loving the questions. I think you should keep giving them.
We've been given the wind up from the mic holder. So thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you for staying out so late. And thank you to Kate Hall and Dmetri Kakmi, and their books are here. You can buy them right over there where Joe was pointing at that desk over there. And in fact, you can probably get signed copies. In fact, of course, if you're listening to this on the podcast, you can't do that unless you come down to Blarney Books and pick one up. And maybe I've got a signed copy already, and I don't even know how that happened. So. You certainly didn't sign it in front of me. But these things can happen. So thank you very much for coming along, and enjoy the rest of the literary weekend. There's lots more events happening this weekend right here in Blarney Books, and it's going to be awesome. So I'm sure I'll see you around there.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.